Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm Meielisa Forstrom. I'm really happy to be here. So I want to thank everybody at Adarat Al-Fanoon who helped make this happen. So today I'm going to talk to you about Islamic art exhibitions. And you can see from the title, it's Spaces, Photographs, and Text, Reinterpretation in International Islamic Art Exhibitions. So I'm going to speak about these 4 exhibitions. And the titles, I think, are really important for the exhibitions. So it's The Art of the Arab Lands, Turkey, Iran, Central Asia, and later South Asia. And that's at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Arts of Islam, which is in the Louvre in Paris, France. And then it's a Museum of Islamic Art in the Pergamon Museum. So it's a museum within a museum. And that's in Berlin, Germany. And then Islamic art at the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, Russia. So I'll give you examples of a few of the changing space and the reinterpretation in the photographs and in the text. And I'm going to explain to you what all of those words mean: reinterpretation, space, and text. So here's a list of all of the Islamic art exhibitions in the United States, Russia, and Europe that have what we say in the museum's profession, reinterpreted or reinstalled. So all of these institutions have reinstalled their Islamic art collection, and like I said, in the past 20 years. And I make the argument in my research that this is probably the most consistently reinstalled art historical discipline ever. So that means they decided to reimagine the exhibitions. So they've took everything off the walls and they changed the stories that they told about the exhibitions. This next image is from, it's actually Saudi Aramco's website, and it's the top world collections of Islamic art. And it lists all of the collections and where they are. And this next slide is all of the collections. So when you see like the red underline, it means the exhibition has already been reinstalled in Islamic art. And the pink underline means that they're going to reinstall. So it's a huge amount of reinstallations. And different stories are being told about Islamic art, which I think is hugely significant for a lot of different reasons. Which I'll get into a little bit as well. So when the Islamic art is reinstalled in a museum, the institution or the museum has they have either one attitude or another attitude. And the first attitude is that the exhibition creators are simply communicating facts, that there is about the artwork, that there's absolutely no interpretation. It has nothing to do with what's going on in the world. And the second one is exhibitions are a type of answer to negative media stereotypes about Muslim peoples or Islam in general. Which is pretty frequent in the United States of America, that there's negative and biased media coverage. And to give you an example of how negative it could be, so this is the other slide. So it's either this attitude, that Islamic art exhibitions are an answer to negative media stereotypes, and this is the mass media narratives. And in my research, I say it's a little more complicated than that, right? That maybe these museums and the exhibition creators are actually perpetuating some of these stereotypes that you see in mass media. And the reason why this is so important is because there was a study that came out a few years ago by a local think tank in New York. And they said that in the New York Times, which is a very liberal paper, that Islam is covered more negatively. Islam is covered negatively 57% of the time, and cancer is reported 34% of the time negatively. So actually, cancer is more positively reported than Islam and Muslim people. So this is why this is really, really important in general. So, which also leads into really brief definitions of Islamophobia and Orientalism, because that's some of what we're going to look at in the museums today. So, the Runnymede Trust, which is a think tank in the United Kingdom, first defined Islamophobia, and they were the first people to use the term in 1997. And they said Islamophobia is unfounded hostility towards Islam. It refers also to the practical consequences of such hostility and unfair discrimination against Muslim individuals and communities, and the exclusion of Muslims from mainstream political and social affairs. So here we can categorize museum going as a social affair. So if you're talking about discrimination, for our purposes, we'll use the last part of that sentence. There's Dr. Stephen Shahi, who's out of Georgetown University, and he makes the argument that Orientalism has paved the way for Islamophobia, and that it's actually the heir to Islamophobia. So, and this is Edward Said's really brief 3 definitions of Orientalism, which we're going to look at a little bit too, but we're not going to get too technical. So it's 1, anybody who teaches, writes about, or researches the Orient. The second definition is Orientalism as a style of thought based upon an ontological and epistemological distinction made between the Orient and the Occident. So that just means making a difference between the West and the East. And the last one, the third, is Orientalism as a Western style of dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. So that's just, like I said, really some really brief definitions and where I root some of my research. So now, getting into the title of the exhibition, which is about reinterpretation. Interpretation, and you can also say it's interpretive theory, which is a very new theory with a set of theories that's within museum studies and museology. So museology is the theory of museums. And all of these other things include museology, but we're gonna look at 3 that's in here. So interpretive theory can include space and design. It also includes written interpretation, which you can also call text, maps and graphics, and photographs. So we're gonna look at all of these things today, except for the maps and the graphics, because it's too much and we don't have a lot of time. So this is what Christopher Whitehead, who's based at the Newcastle University in the United Kingdom, this is what he defines as interpretation. So interpretation is inclusive of the manipulation of the physical display environment, meaning the exhibition design and lighting, and the development of supporting materials such as text panels, labels, audio guides, interactives, audiovisuals, and so on. And then he goes even further and he says that interpretation doesn't only include how art is hung within a gallery space like we're in right now, but it actually includes everything that put the object into that space. And he calls that the ingress of the object, and all the social and political acts that do that. So it's everything which preceded, surround, and follow its production and consumption. So he said that's all included and embodied in the interpretation somehow. So this is how I define interpretation. The words, phrases, design, and graphics employed to interpret a museum exhibition theme and/or art object that are displayed in museum spaces that are presumably meant to translate and make accessible the exhibition and the art objects to diverse museum audiences. So my argument here is that when you see interpretation on a gallery wall, which I don't see any here, but I'm sure there are, is that they have to make this accessible to a non-specialist audience. People have to understand, and they definitely shouldn't include any societal biases, right? So that's what I study generally. So I'll give us the next images of the same, about museology and interpretive theory, and these are the things that we're gonna be looking at. Particularly when we talk about spaces, what I'm really interested in is each of the Islamic exhibitions that I showed you at the beginning of the presentation, the list and then the map, Each of the spaces have changed. And I've divided the space into like 3 different categories. And one way that Islamic art is exhibited is called contextual, which means that the Islamic art is put into a context. So that means if a museum has a carpet, that they display the carpet on the floor instead of hanging on the wall. Or if there's a mosque lamp, that the mosque lamp will be hanging, that it won't be in a glass box at eye level. So that's one type of way museums display Islamic art or have the change. The other type of space that I've categorized is called place. And that means the place of the exhibition itself is really important because of the relationship to other parts of the museum. And I'll show you examples. This will probably be more clear as I go through these. And then there's the white cube, which means that the art is hung in a very modernist or contemporary style, where it's meant to be looked at as an artwork in a white space with 4 white walls, which is meant to provoke a relationship with the artwork. For photographs, we're going to look for things like anonymity and uncritical use of them. And I'll explain to you what that means. So there's a lot of photographs that accompany exhibitions of Islamic art. So I'm really interested in how these photographs are used and what they're meant to communicate to the audience. So are they critically being understood? Are they critically being used? Are they being interpreted? Or are they just there to create a sense of context? And then text, we're also looking for anonymity. If we're looking to see if there's, if the text appear to be authorless. Because if texts in a museum appear to be entirely objective, that could be potentially problematic for museum audiences because they may not feel like they belong. So we're going to look at each of these exhibitions for these things. So firstly, photographs have been studied in museums. They've been studied as art objects, and they've been studied as using photography theory. They've been studied as part of museum collections and archives, but they've not been studied as part of interpretive theory, which I think is really interesting. That's what I'm interested in doing, is discussing these photographs as part of interpretation. Oftentimes, this is how photographs are discussed. So photographs are discussed as contextual data. So it implies that there's some truth. Like whenever you use the word data, at least in English, it implies that there's some truth to that and that it's completely objective information. So that there's some truth and that without interpretation. So they're saying, photographs, you could fall into that category of uncritical use. Or photographs are didactic. And didactic in the English language, it means intended to teach. So how is a photograph doing that? This next slide I'm gonna actually slip. So photographs generally, and these are 2 scholars who discuss photographs, and they say more work needs to be used in the study of photographs. So photographs in museums remained largely unproblematized space of didactic certainty, creating what Gabby Porter calls an economy of truth within museums. So I'm really interested, I think a lot, to use Gabby Porter's term, I think museums in general were often taught, unless you study museums, you take what the museum says about an exhibition or what the museum says about an artwork, and you take it for a fact and you take it as a truth, and you don't think you can question it, which I think is potentially really problematic, at least in the United States when there's many underprivileged people, and if they feel like they don't belong in the museum, that's potentially a problem. So like I said, we're gonna look for text to see if they're anonymous and if they're authoritative. And there's scholars who discuss both of these works or both of these phrases, but I'm not gonna get into that. So again, we're looking at these 3. Has anyone been to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, this exhibition? Yeah, you have? Since they redid it? Yeah. So you can see that this is the facade of the building here, and this is the oldest museum in the United States. This is the 3rd place that it existed, and this building opened up in 1870. So for us in the United States, that's very old, which is not the case when you're in the Middle East or parts of Europe. And some of the curators commissioned, they call this the Moroccan court. And a bunch of architects and curators and researchers went over to Fez, Morocco, and then they did a bunch of research, they created a design, and then they had artisans come over. And so this is an actual space in the museum, which is a really interesting thing. So already, and you can see this when you walk into the entrance. To give you an idea of where Islamic art is located in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, it's in this corner right here. And they just had a new map produced. This is the new map for the museum, which we're not going to talk that much about, but I talked to the people who created this map, and you can see this red line. This is the route that the museum suggests visitors take. And as you can see, it does not enter the Islamic art. I mean, this is Arab Lands, Turkey, Iran, but it's the Department of Islamic Art, right? So they changed their name to go to a geographic, but there's no, so also really interesting. And if you look at the space of it, it's in the corner of the institution. You can't by accident wander into there, which is very much unlike the rest of the museum. So an Islamic art in the Metropolitan Museum of Art didn't always occupy this space. It actually occupied different corridors before they had a space. So the art was more in connection to other art forms, other art historical disciplines. So it had connections to what the museum calls Near Eastern art, but what that really means is pre-Islamic. And they also have, it had other connections to actually a lot of different Asian art. So Islamic art wasn't in this unified space. And one of the reasons why Islamic art gets sectioned away from other areas, from other art historical areas and museums, is because they receive a lot of money. They receive a lot of donations from individuals. And they can actually take up more space. So the last time these galleries were redone before 2011, they opened up in 2011, it was 1975. And they actually take up more space in the museum and a similar space. So there's this changing space. We saw one example of how the space changed with the Moroccan court, which was new for the 2011 reinstallation. And then this is a map of the galleries themselves. And as you can see, there's a suggested route. So you see there's an arrow over here, and that they suggest that you go through the exhibitions more or less chronologically and geographically. So you're supposed to go around here counterclockwise and then come out. And this is their suggestion to the museum visitor. But you can also see that it's sectioned away, this map, from the rest of the museum. Here's another view of the Moroccan court. And then you can see here, and you can maybe guess that I'm starting to say that the Metropolitan Museum of Art uses contextual, because this is what they call the Spanish ceiling. So they have a carpet on the floor, and then they have a ceiling close to as it could have been originally placed. And then this is called the Damascus room, where they reconstructed a room that you can't actually enter. There's a glass barrier. And then some of the rest of the exhibitions look like this. So this is in Iran. Here's a panel, just to give you an idea of what the panels look like. So this is what we call text, like text panels. Here's some more. This is in the same room. Here's another panel. Samara. And then this part of the exhibition is sectioned away. It's a little hallway. And then you can go into this room where you see this photograph. You can see a photograph of when the European men, or from actually American men, discovered this. And then they have a interesting interactive that a lot of children use, and actually adults. And in this interactive, they have a lot of photographs. So as you can see here, there are, Arab people working on and it's in Nishapur, Iran, and they have a lot of workers, but none of them are named, which is what I'm really interested when we're looking at the uncritical use of photographs. And however, whenever there's a white person or a European, a person of European descent, is that they are named in the interpretation. So this says John Upton, Walter Hauser, and Charles Wilkinson. So it's really interesting to me, why this happened, because if we go back to the slide before, like obviously these people worked really hard and were fundamental. And local people worked at these exhibition sites. They couldn't have done the work without them. But for me, this is really, really problematic because maybe we don't know their names. Maybe they weren't the people discovered, but I still think there needs to be some sort of interpretation saying that and not just having people there for other people to look at a museum. So they do this a few more times. And like I said, some of this is really subtle, but I think my argument is that these perpetuate these differences. So here's that argument. And then this is getting into another part, the Mamluks, because there's absolutely no people present in any of the exhibition in the Met. The only people that are named are white people. So you can see that that's the panel that's closer, and then we're going to take an even closer look at the photograph, and that there's just a woman sitting outside the Mosque of Sultan Hassan. So also, who is this person? Why is she here? If she was white, would she be named? And there's this idea that's like this Orientalist view of local people that I think is really problematic. So here's another panel. This is in the Ottoman room, and it's called Arts of the Loom. And you can see there's a woman behind there. And then this is the text. It just says carpet weaver. Also, an unnamed person. So next to the Moroccan court, you can see, and I'm going to show you an example of how this is good. And, the Metropolitan Museum of Art is absolutely great. They've given me a lot of access for research. And I try to tell them, these things, and some curators agree and some don't. But this says a panel with geometric patterns. And as you can see, there's no artist named here. So when you're looking at text of Islamic art in the United States, it can be hugely problematic because in Islamic art, they'll never say, or rarely, not never, because I'm going to show you an example of when they do they, if it's a European decorative art, like if it's a bowl that was created in Greece, ancient Greece, or somewhere in the Netherlands, it will always say unknown artist. And here they don't say anything. They just said, it says attributed to Granada. So again, this is potentially problematic for me. And I think some of this has to do with a lot of the production of Islamic art, is that it was done historically in workshops by numerous different people, but there were individuals creating these things that worked, right? So to give you a really good example, it is at the Detroit Institute of Arts. They have a great Islamic art collection. And you can see that there's a velvet panel behind me. And then the text here, and they're really known for good interpretation, it actually says unknown artist, right? Which I think, again, is hugely important. And also doesn't happen if you go into any European gallery. If there's an artwork on the wall, if they don't know who painted it, they'll always say unknown artist. So this idea that space is a little bit subjective, but the spaces are separate. And then you look at the photographs and none of the local people are named, only the white people. And actually there's no people present in most text panels. So I think it's a huge problem. We're gonna leave the Metropolitan and go to the Arts of Islam at the Louvre. So as you can see here, these are the famous Pais pyramids. Have people been there? It's closer, right? Close to New York, yeah? Did you go to Islamic art? Yeah. Their new one? Yeah. So the Met opened up, the Metropolitan Museum of Art opened up in 2011, and this one opened up in 2012. And I put Pais pyramids here because that's the iconic, how the Louvre is known. And then this is the first architectural addition to the Louvre since Pais pyramids. And Pais pyramids were completed in 1989. So it's a big deal for the Louvre, which does not add on architecture. So this was designed by a Frenchman and an Italian. And you can see it's this wave-like roof, which is interesting. And it's in the Danan courtyard. So you can see also it's kind of just sectioned away from the rest of the collection. Is that it's literally not included in the rest of the museum walls, right? And you have to, I'll show you. So this is like when you go in, you can see that, you know, this architecture and the artwork is in relationship to the facade of the outside of the Louvre. And the Louvre, if you don't know, was a former royal palace. So, yeah, and you have to go through this like tunnel to get through there. So it's really obvious. My point is it's really obvious that you're going into a separate part of the museum. They make it fairly certain. And then once you get in, this is the top floor. There's 2 floors. The top floor, which has a lot of light, so it's the older artworks that aren't light sensitive. And then the newer artworks are downstairs, which I'll show you a few images. So here's some more images from here. You can see that the interpretation is different than the Metropolitan. There's not a whole lot of photographs. We get into this photograph here. This is the only photograph that I was able to find, actually, which are no people anyway. But what I really want to talk to you about is the text here. So this is a large case. And then looking at the other examples, it says, let me look at it, the genesis of an art. And if we read this panel together, there's really no mention of any human intervention at all. Which is pretty similar to like all of their interpretation at the Louvre. And I'm going to read the English version here. So Islamic art did not emerge without Arab conquest. Formative periods, nonlinear developments shaped its history. In the Mediterranean region, traces of late antiquity, already tempered by Christianity, are apparent in the ornamentation of wood paneling, bone tablets, and metal items. Everyday objects such as oil lamps remained unchanged, but gradually received Arabic inscriptions, thus dating them as post-conquest. So when I read this, there's no people present. And there's absolutely almost no reference to what's being shown there. So this is really problematic for me as well, because it could perpetuate, like I said, these ideas. It's almost like a dehumanization of the art, or this lack of human intervention in the creation of the art. And a lot of museum texts are like this. And like I said, besides, there was hardly any photographs. What the Louvre did have is that they had a lot of drawings, which were also part of like Orientalist conquests that the French undertook, was like drawings of antiquity. Okay, so moving on to the Pergamon Museum. So this is a museum of Islamic art in the Pergamon. And it's in Berlin. They're redoing the entire museum. Has anyone been there? Yeah? I like all of these exhibitions, but it's the second floor that we're going on, of the museum. So it's after like the famous Ishtar Gate, and you go up the stairs, and then the entire floor is also like a circuit. So you see this when you get to the top of the stairs, which you can see, and then this is like the introduction area. And what I call the introduction area, I don't know if they call it that, but there's a lot going on. I mean, there's a huge map, there's people sitting, there's an introduction panel on the left, like text panel here. And then on the right, there's people who have given money to the exhibition. So I was really interested in these photographs because they're really interesting because they show how Islamic art was originally displayed at the museum, which I think is really important because it really shows you the history of the exhibition of Islamic art. Even before the 1910 exhibition, which was a big exhibition in Munich. So there was carpets on the wall, and they placed objects that looked similar together. So this is how it was, and this wasn't even at the, it was in the Bode Museum, so the Islamic art collection. And then the picture next to it is an image of, it's an image of what they expect their galleries to look like. So it like almost acts like a photograph, but it's like a photograph of something non-existent or a photograph of the future, which I think is a really interesting way or approach or way to introduce your visitors to the exhibition. So basically telling them like what they're about to experience is like totally temporary, but there also is this recognition that it's part of this long art historical tradition, which I think is really interesting as well. So the way that photographs are everywhere in this museum, you can see that they're used to contextualize the artwork entirely. So this is actually an incorrect photograph because the timing's off, and I talked to a few of the curators about this, was that this is a photograph of some part of Ottoman Turkey, but the photograph or the thing, however it was, blown up, this is an original, it's a reproduction, was like 2 centuries later than the artwork. So I think that's also really interesting. So it's giving this like false sense, and nowhere is that recognized in the gallery space. So you can see that the objects are contained within the photograph. So like I said, I became really interested in studying this type of things. And it's the same thing here. I want to look closely at this next photograph. So this was part of an exhibition right when you walked in. It was about ancient samurai. And you can see that this is just a close-up of right here, where there's a few different photographs. And then there's this image here. So like the Metropolitan Museum of Art, there's an individual here, and nowhere in the interpretation of this photograph is the human being acknowledged. And I learned from talking to a few different archaeologists that oftentimes when there was an archaeological expedition, in order to get a sense of the height of a building, they'd ask a local person to stand in front of it. And this was like pretty common practice. But again, this person is entirely, unnamed, and, the photographer is named, but not the person, which I think would not happen in an exhibition of like European art, or if it was a white person individually. So the last exhibition we're going to look at is Islamic art at the Hermitage. And really, really interesting where Islamic art is located. So this is the Winter Palace, which is part of the Hermitage. Islamic art is there, and this is their iconic room, which I'll talk about a little later as well, which has a lot of metals from, like ancient metals from Iran and even pre-Islamic Iran, which I hadn't seen before. This is the map for the exhibition plan, and the Hermitage is really confusing. And actually, when I was in Russia, I was late for a meeting because I couldn't find my way out of there. And I told them, I said, I'm really sorry, like I really got lost and I was really embarrassed. And they said, no. They said the only people who are in the Hermitage are the people who work there and the people that can't find their way out. So like it happens to everyone, which I think was really funny. So Islamic art, they have, in Islamic art history, it's a really important collection. It's probably not important with the amount of objects that they have. They have such a huge amount of objects, but Islamic art is on the 3rd floor, and it's right here in this corner. Ooh. And I'll go in and I'll show you here. So it's this like light blue colored, and I actually couldn't find it again, and 2 of the guards couldn't tell me how to get there. So, and there's only one staircase there, and I found out later that this was the old servant quarters that they have the Islamic art in. And I thought that was really interesting as well. So again, like all of the other exhibitions of Islamic art, they're just sectioned away. So like spatially, there's often a distance that's made between Islamic art and the rest of a collection. And I'm not sure why. And I think each institution has their specific reasons. Like I said, donors have stipulations of how they want the exhibition being produced. But I'm really interested in the overall effect of the visitor. So how does this affect the visitor? If you can't find where Islamic art is, it's a really important collection, and the guards can't even help you. So you go in here, and then this is the first room, and they have these showcases, as you can see, with like really important objects, which I think they were beautiful. You can see them here again. And then they had this wood paneling for a lot of the exhibition cases, and they also use color, like I said, which is really interesting as well. And then there's this long hallway that leads down to these windows, which you can see all the way in the back. You can see just the light coming from them and these two women who are sitting there. And when you go closer, this is a view from the window. So this is the Neva River, and it's this iconic place. It's really important in St. Petersburg history, and it overlooks what is called Peter and Paul Fortress, which is actually where St. Petersburg was founded. So really, and these rostrum columns, which are the red columns, are hugely important. So it's like one of the best views that you can see of St. Petersburg, and yet like it's hidden away. And also it contains this Islamic art. So when I was going for this exhibition, I said, wow, this is really unlike Berlin, and this is really unlike the Metropolitan Museum, which were really interested in creating this sense of like Islamic context, right? They want to have like the artwork in the spaces. But the St. Petersburg, or it's the Hermitage Museum, the curators were really interested, I think, in Islamic art becoming part of the city, because they didn't block the views of the windows. And yes, they didn't put like, light sensitive objects in this room, but it's a really, really unique approach. And I probably didn't mention that. It was similar to the approach at the Louvre, that I felt like the sense of place at the Louvre is that you were constantly, especially on that first floor in the Louvre, you were constantly aware that you were within like the Louvre, or you were outside the walls, but inside the Louvre complex, which I think is hugely important, that they didn't want to put away the outside, which is, like I said, unlike the Metropolitan and unlike Berlin. So here's one of the images from that room when you're standing like at the window. And there's more images here, which I think is really interesting as well. So some of these were fans items from the 15th century Syria and Egypt. And then they also had this collection, which I thought was really, really interesting. So, which as you can see, these collection, it looks like broken pottery. So very unimpressive from afar, but when you got closer to it, it was really interesting because they actually decoded the symbols, and they told you what that meant, right? So I can't read any of these, but some of them were like, if there was a cup, it was like this was the cup bearer's urn or bowl or whatever. And I thought it brought in such an element of human activity that I hadn't seen, and it was done by a really simple interpretation. So all of these symbols mean different things. Like I said, which I'll try to read here because it's really hard when it's blown up. For the crescent moon, they were either symbols of the families or symbols of the professions. So again, I think without doing much, it brought in, like I said, the human element that I hadn't seen before in any exhibitions of Islamic art that I'd seen. So to conclude, the space not only have all of the major exhibitions of Islamic art been reimagined and different stories told, is that the spaces of Islamic art exhibition have changed. And pretty consistently, those spaces are separate from the rest of the museums, which I think has a role in the effect on the visitor. And I'm not saying that there's some conspiracy amongst museums people trying to distance Islamic art. I think it's really interesting that, a visitor has to go up to the third floor, get lost a few times, or, it's not, like I said, part of the Metropolitan Museum of Art's red line, and they don't even recommend that you go into the institution. And the space is really important. Like Islamic art as in context has, I think, a much different effect on the visitor, as does bringing in the sense of place. So whether you're at the Louvre or just like St. Petersburg, like I just talked about. I think consistently there's an uncritical use and anonymity, like being anonymous, associated with the use of photographs in Islamic art exhibition, is that they're not interpreted, and not once have I ever seen a local person's name appear in them. And maybe that local person, they don't know that local person's name, but I think it's hugely important that they say that to the visitor. And there's a reason why that person's name wasn't recorded. And what reason is that? And they can interpret it for that, is that maybe these people weren't as valued as the Europeans and the Americans that went there. And text. Instead of having an art object be attributed to a place, is that there's no attribution to any human element involved. And I think that further distances the people, especially Americans, who probably on a whole know less about Islam, and that could perpetuate these societal ideologies that I discussed earlier in the presentation. So that's all I have for you today, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. I'll put my contact information back up. So does anyone have, yeah? Do you want the microphone? Do you have a question? Yeah. Oh, thanks.
State University. Heritage, so I'm glad that you like our exhibition.
Oh, great.
Yes, and should I ask you English or Arabic? In English.
English.
Okay. So, thank you very much. The only point I disagree with you is the point that you made in the start, that the exhibitions present only facts, not the interpretations.
Yeah.
I would disagree with it because, to my mind, when the music authorities decide what to put in the exhibition, they take the pieces of art from a huge pool that they have. So the way and the number and it's actually what pieces of art you choose for the exhibition, because thus you construct the Islamic art you want to present. So, for example, if you include wine jars or weapons in the exhibition, you're determining the way the people would determine the outlook of Islamic art for them.
Yeah.
And also, I'm sorry, and also the text panels. You can include every information you want about.
Exactly.
For example, one small example here in Heritage, for example, Chinese guides. They say when they provide, let's say, then they tell about the Chinese exponents to the Chinese tourists. They say, like, it is ours, we'll get that.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Yeah. So, I maybe wasn't clear. I totally agree with you. So I was saying that the institutional attitudes, I can go to that slide. I was saying that these are the attitudes that they have, but they're not that I agree with. So that's probably, it's ejected. Oh, no, here. So I was saying, and again, I probably could have made that clear. So I said, these are like the institutional attitudes, like we're just presenting facts. This is only, the only thing we could say about it is what we said, and that it isn't subjective information. So thank you for that. Thanks for that clarification. Okay. Yes.
That's on. Thank you so much for the presentation. I really walked in late. Yes, I was really interested in the part where you talked about the unnamed excavators on the net exhibition.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like important to point to problems, but some of these problems are can't be remedied. But certainly there is work now there is work now in, like, some people are interested in the history of archaeology of the Middle East that are trying to find these people and give them names and understand their histories.
Yeah.
But for me, it's like giving a name to an indigenous archaeologist is not the answer. It's bringing in local people into the scene of archaeology for them to be the people that excavate and have a name in this international scene without the native attached to it is the main problem. But I don't know, I think part of the objective of exhibitions should be to promote Islamic art on its own terms and not in the terms of Western museums and Western institutions. And that's where, at least for me, and I'd have to think about it more, but I was wondering what you thought and people thought. I mean, saying unnamed artist onto objects that are identified not by the individual craftsmanship, but by generally a tradition, by where objects are found, by how these things are attributed to certain places, is far more important than trying to impose the way in which Western institutions characterize Western art onto like Islamic art. But also, I don't know, like I've seen a version of this presentation before, and I think part of what's like very important to point out about the Met's approach is that they take the traditions for what they are in their context rather than try to homogenize Islam from, Bilad al-Sham all the way into Al-Andalus from 7th into 18th century, and it ends there. And so, like, part of the problem is that outside of like what images and what text we put is how we exhibit the diversity of all the peoples who've called themselves Muslims throughout the year. And I don't know, I'm interested in how the exhibitions can take some of the primary debates in Islamic art history as a scholarly discipline into the exhibitions. And I'm wondering, if you, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's a lot to think about. So yeah, I mean, the first point that you made, so, they may not know, like I said, like, probably no one's going to know who those people were, but surprisingly, sometimes there are people looking for these people. And I think museums who in the United States receive a lot of government funding, they do have a lot of donors, they have this responsibility to discuss, especially now it's very, excavations are very different. Like they have a responsibility to discuss like the societal and political atmosphere that these things emerged in, right? Which like, we can't deny colonialism. We can't deny Orientalist exhibition or, going to like the Levant, but I think we can talk about them. And like, this was accepted practice at this time. Maybe today we wouldn't do it the same, but I think when you're just putting up a photograph with this like unnamed Arab man does perpetuate some of those same things. And also, I don't know if I should have the answer, because I'm not a person who's Middle Eastern and I'm not an Islamic art historian. But what I'm interested in is like pointing out these problems and like the potential for these problems. And, parts of my research that I didn't talk about was like, I interviewed visitors. So I interviewed visitors in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and I talked to them because I was really interested in like the visitor experience. So I was really critical of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, initially based on just their text, from reading their text, because I argue that their text exhibits some of these societal ideologies. But the talking to visitors really changed my mind about the design and the space, because the visitors loved it. And they felt really wonderful in that Moroccan courtyard. And that was the most consistently, out of all the interviews I did with visitors, it was the most consistently mentioned thing. Unfortunately, the way that the Met interpreted that courtyard creation was they took videos of the Moroccan men in fez caps, chipping away in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which I didn't show you, but is also problematic, because those guys didn't come to work in a fez cap every day, so like what type of performance or consumption or what kind of ideas about the audience do the curators have to do that? I forgot the rest of the questions.
No,
this is
fine. This is fine. But
okay.
Like, if I may add, like, I think if you point to the colonial legacies of some of the excavations, the big elephant is in the room is why the objects remain in Western museums. And so, partly opening up this question, brings up a whole set of issues that are irresolvable because the Met's not.
Yeah. And the other point about putting like Western art practices, I know because I go back and forth, and again, I'm not the person like who should decide this, right? Like, I think it should be a lot of different people. Or like I pointed out that the Met calls their galleries art of the Arab lands, Turkey, Iran, Central Asia, and later South Asia. And the only countries that are named, Turkey and Iran, those are the people who donated the most money to the galleries, so it's like those countries which are also not historically correct, right? Like Turkey didn't exist. whatever. So like there's all of these issues that bring it up. But I think until like, at least in the United States, unless like an awareness develops, like I feel like they should always say unknown artist, because people just have no idea about the production. And yes, most of the artwork was produced by workshops and individuals and collectives. But I mean, even I talked to the people at the Detroit Institute, and they're actually changing it to unknown artists for Islamic art. And they're going through and they're changing all their panels because they feel that strongly about it. But I think somehow people need to be present in there. And I think it does get really technical, but I see your point about it being like, there isn't the cult of the artist, in most.
And that's a good thing.
Yeah.
As far as I'm concerned.
Right. But that's a very Western European, Renaissance-based thing. So yeah, I see your point. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you. I prefer to call it like so-called Islamic art. There's no Islamic art. It was about the Southern Arabs who has nothing, only talking.
Yeah.
And with all respect for Quran, it's qira'ah, reading.
Yeah.
The other, it was the civilization. And separated. They have their own identity, the Northern Arab, and even the monarch. So it was controlling through belief. And they grab on Persian, calligraphy from the Amazighi. So all the Muslims sacrifice because of Islam. So now we got Arab West. There's no Arab West.
Yes. Or they say West Asia now.
So they control through belief. You are believer or non-believer. And they interfere only for changing faces, statues. So I think there's no Islamic art. We should go back specific to the people. It was Lost Kingdom. I'm talking about, this is my book. Lost Kingdom, Nabati, and after that Ghassani, during the Byzantine occupation. And they did also, Byzantines, they did damage also in art.
Yes.
So Lost Kingdom, Forgotten Nations.
Yeah, I think Islamic art, the terminology is very, very problematic.
No, so-called Islamic art.
So-called Islamic art is very, very
I
problematic.
think it's stealing.
Yeah.
You see calligraphy, the Persian art, all these thousands of years, just they took it with this, and until now, we are under control. I'll go politically. That tribe now control all the Arab, the Muslim country. Even the parties of Islam, they have to be like, get that holiness blood, which is life. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for everything you said.
Oh.
But I have a question. It might sound ridiculous, but why would they have a space for Islamic art if they don't want to show it in a positive way? Like, why would they dehumanize the people behind the art? Unless if it sounds like a like mean it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think a lot of it is unintentional. I think it's also the history of the discipline, and it's how the curators have been trained, is that they've been indoctrinated into their discipline because the term, like we were just saying, the so-called Islamic art, it's essentially like a European creation to group Islamic art together. And before it was called Islamic art in Germany, it was called Mohammedan Kunst, like in German. And then it was called, Mohammedan, it was called Near Eastern. And then at the Metropolitan, it's called decorative. And the Metropolitan Museum of Art didn't start collecting Islamic art intentionally before 1971 or something. It was always part of larger collections. So it existed in these much different spaces. So even the term and the grouping of Islamic art, and I think, throughout my research, there's Islamic art historians who get it, the curators, and I talk to them and they totally understand where I'm coming from, and they actively try to work against that. So one of these curators is Laura Weinstein. She's at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and she's redoing all of her galleries. And she and I were at a conference, I think it was like October, and she was like, Melissa, I'm taking you out to lunch. She's like, I want your advice. And I was like, okay, because her and I are friendly. And she was like, we're going to call our galleries the galleries of Islamic cultures. She's like, what do you think? And just like waited for and I was like, I've never heard that term before. I think it admits that, the so-called Islamic world is not one thing, because that's another problem. When you call things like Islamic art or Islamic world, it just groups everybody together and it doesn't admit the plurality of it. So there's people like Laura Weinstein, and then there's people who I won't name, who don't understand. And it's that institutional, it's that institutional attitude where they're like, what are you talking about? This is a bowl, and this is the information about the bowl. We don't know who this guy is. So it's not like they're actively trying it. They're just not self-assessing their knowledge. They're not interested in the history of their own knowledge. And I think that's problematic.
And from your own experience, does this happen with like different arts, like Chinese art or any art?
So, yeah, I think it happens a little bit in Asian art. It's less so because I think just because of the quality of it, and not the quality of it, the quantity of artwork that many people went to acquire, and there was more like collectors of like Tibetan art or art from Nepal or Chinese art, and there's just larger quantities of it, like in museums, and I think they know more about it. So even as a lot of the Islamic art institutions, they can't show because they don't know how it got there, they don't know what it is, and so they just like remain in storage. And they won't show those artworks. They just have no idea. And if they can't date it, or they don't have the money to date it, or whatever. So I think somewhat with Asian art, I think it happens a little bit in African art as well. I started to look at photographs of people in African exhibitions, and they're largely kind of this old way of looking at people of color, which is also really unfortunate. Yes.
I'm really sorry. I'm absolutely fascinated, and I got the camera on.
Oh.
Because I want to look deeper, more into what you've been saying, and if I can ask you about maybe later. I want to say something that I think that this attitude that comes, that the madam is talking about, is basically believing more in countries than in people, which is quite a modern thing.
Yes.
Because if you go back to the time of the creation of what's that out there, nobody knew what is country. This is a colonial idea that's been imposed on the world. And for people to really truly understand that when they say a Nigerian person, they're using an approximate label of somebody who is the same as them. That this is what is often making the difference. I'm trying to propose an exhibition to the United Nations on this theme, coming from this region of common humanity. One of the things, I don't know how much it can actually be useful and get across, because this use of the word Middle East is so patronizing and ridiculous. And people are asking, what could it be changed to? And I say, well, just to provoke something and to make it look deeper, let's say cradle of civilization. Because the civilization they've inherited, most of the building blocks and tools came from here. Whereas here, all of those sciences, you might call it, the reason they didn't have people who are like artists, like this and this. In a way, scientists were seen as they weren't defined in the same way that we have. They weren't cutting everything into things and things and things. They were so maybe their attitude, we're looking at the basic building blocks of Western, even this word, medicine, writing, geometry, mathematics, architecture, cartography, astronomy. I mean, the people in the Middle Ages in Europe thought the world was flat and nobody else.
Yeah.
And so, are coming from here. Yet, the sense of all of the communities here going back to time is all of those things were seen as part of a whole. Whereas since they lost their faith and their spirituality in a lot of the West, and this very analytical way of doing things, if you cut things up in pieces enough, you'll find the answer. They're not seeing any objectivity at all of the relationship to the whole. So I think that trying to encourage that starting point of first of all recognizing what is in common before what is different, I think is something that actually this region of the world could help the Western world to heal and remember if it was only acknowledged and appreciated and credited for what it is. And it's almost like, sorry to talk too much, the atheists, the Darwinists, and the scientists in the West has given itself, through maybe its denial of colonialism, the fact that it can't really deal with what it's done in an honest way, the same as Israel's doing it. They can't, unless they can forgive themselves, they can't ask for, they can't forgive themselves until they can ask for forgiveness. They did a lot wrong to other people. So that thing, sorry, I've been lost, but I'm trying to get to a point. That the West can heal from the attitudes of here. And one of the important things to show is that you really have to, for a lot of those people that are born into psychological realities, they have to try and really put themselves into the position of the people at that time. So whatever can encourage that feeling of commonality, I feel would be a good starting place from any perspective to start to understand that all these labels we put on people are not helping us. Yeah. I had a dream 2 days ago. I dreamed about the president of Israel or the prime minister or whatever you call it. So I was very surprised. And he was sitting next to me in the room and being very casual about something like, hi, you're best of best, I can talk to you. And he was like, oh, something with taxi driver drama. And I said, no, yeah, I am happy you came because there's something I've been needing to tell you. All these Jews in Arabs, it's not real. It's just selling wars. It's just for selling wars. It's not useful for anything else. If you want to make any decision from any sense of perspective or clarity, you have to step completely above that and completely above them and us. If you want to look for healing any of the damage that has been done by them and us. And that was it.
Yeah. There's this article, I don't know if you've heard of it. It's a woman, I think she's at a Northwestern in Chicago called Jessica Weingart. And the article is 2007, and it's called The Humanity Game. And it's really interesting because she touches upon, like, in a very broad terms, like she doesn't get into detail, but she talks about very, like kind of tropes that are present in exhibitions from the Middle East and Islamic art. And one of the things she talks about, and she's critical of your first point of what she said, she says we have to be careful about, making sure that we don't do what she calls, what is it called actually? So it's the past glories of Islam trope. So she says, because oftentimes these exhibitions, there was one of them, it was called 1001 Inventions, and it traveled around. It started in Manchester and it came to New York and it went to Dubai and somewhere. And it was all about how a lot of the inventions that we use today and the knowledge that we have today is based on exactly what you're saying. But the fact that it just leaves it there. And they say, oh, look how great this world was then. But, now nothing, so, and she said you have to be wary of that, which I think too. I'm not saying that you're wrong. I think commonalities are a great place to start. I'm not 100% certain it's only in the past. I think people can relate to each other a lot more differently. Like a great initiative that Berlin is undertaking, the Museum of Islamic Art, and Stefan Weber, who's the director of the museum there, they have this great thing where they have new people, so people who are either refugees or new immigrants to Germany, and it's called Multaka, which I think is a meeting point. And they have people giving tours of the galleries, and it's not a tour of like the art history, it's about what certain objects mean to them. And their tours are open to anybody and they're free. So like I get your point, and I think it's true. But yeah, Okay, so you had your hand up for a while.
I feel like there's a trend going on that museums are trying to fill because of the concept of Orientalism, because of Islamophobia, and because of just the general trend of how media portrays Islam.
Yeah.
So I feel like just based on what you said and just my just understanding the content, I feel like they're just simply trying to fill a trend.
Like
Just a trend.
have like just
It's like a fashion.
oh yes, I agree with you, because some of those reinstallations which I put up, some of them were, I talked to some of the people, some of them were motivated. They're like, oh well, this museum reinstalled and then this museum, so we can't be the only ones who don't have a new exhibition. And then there's a lot of money for it.
Yeah, and I feel like this trend is just they're just doing the minimum. The minimum
Right.
thing. And when it comes to Detroit, the reason that I thought that Detroit is interesting is because a lot of Arabs do live in Detroit,
Yeah.
especially in New York, Michigan. So Detroit is not too far away from it's not too far away from them, and I feel like Detroit would be a place where they would take the things that you said into consideration, like creating saying the unknown artist, or just humanizing the content displayed.
Yes.
So I feel like this trend just really depends on where you are in the world. Especially like, for example, in New York, the place that in a place that's like highly there's a huge number of Zionists contributing to the art scene. It's just generally very like anti-Arab, or like taking the concept of Orientalism and then just turning it into this neo-Orientalism, but they're using that as a framework, as like a like they're hiding, showing exactly what the situation. They're just using. They're just pretending to not be Orientalist, but they're actually Orientalist.
Yeah, they're doing it now.
Because it's a trend.
Yes. Because it's like, and I think it's the subtlety of it too. Like, I think they're like saying like, oh, we're doing all of this, but then they're not looking critically at the content that they're exhibiting. Yeah, I think so. And, even at the Metropolitan, like when they were redoing, they took 8 years. They closed down in 2003 and then they reopened in 2011. So for 8 years, it was like closed, which was a big deal. And it was after September 11th. And there was all of the art critics saying, this is terrible. We shouldn't close this down at this time. We need to. If you read in their notes, they said they had these groups of people, like these like steering groups, but all the steering groups were like the most famous imams in New York. Like they weren't like normal people, doing any of that. So like, these people who have a lot of power and have a lot of influence, helping gear the museum may not be how, again, normal people just experience it, So yeah, thanks. Yeah.
So I just came late, so I didn't see everything.
Yeah.
So I have some sort of gaps to fill in. So I'm just commenting on the thing that has been said about Islamic culture. I guess there is a patronizing and dehumanizing way of portraying the Islamic culture. Now, having said that, I guess that the Islamic culture in its own has to be, let's say, put in more in a completely other framework, because Islam has spread over, as everybody knows, in a huge area, and each area has its established, let's say, civilizations on its own. So I guess that although it's not always fair to know in the counterpart of Islamic art, I guess it's really unfair to demonize the concept. Now, I have two examples from history. One is from the Sumerians and the Akkadians. Now, the Sumerians superseded the Akkadians, and they were Semitic by nature. And the Sumerians were of a different race and culture and religion. However, they adopted that religion, and they introduced their own language to their culture. Now, when they did so, nobody can say that the Akkadian artworks are Sumerian. They are Akkadian in nature, and they are based, by fact, on the Sumerian artifacts. Another example of that is the Etruscans, who invaded Italy or Tuscana, and they introduced the alphabet to Europe. And that alphabet was taken from the Phoenicians. So in this context, we cannot say, well, because it was Phoenician, then we cannot call it the Latin alphabet. Okay. So another thing, there is a book on identity. It's called An Identity by معارض. Now, he really asserts so many important points. One of them is that identity is so complex And it's not bound to one element. I mean, you can be Iraqi, I'm Iraqi, I'm Muslim, and I am Mesopotamian by nature. And I cannot separate all of those elements and say, well, I am into Sumerians, I'm Sumerian because I'm into Sumerians, or I'm Muslim because I'm into Muslim art. I have all of those things combined in one container, and it's me. And now that will take us to another topic, which is the individual identity versus the community identity, which is a whole world of discussions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And also like when you talk about it institutional, the imposition of that, like, so the museum has to call this art something. What is the least problematic term for those people? But that's subjective, just like your own individual identity is subjective. So yeah, I totally agree. Yeah. Hi.
Thank you so much for that. My question is, aren't you worried that humanizing the history of colonialism is problematic by itself? Because this is not a happy story. This is a bunch of cultures that were sabotaged and made into aesthetic subject of study. And the fact that they remain in that state is testament to what happened. Isn't that more important than to fix it?
Maybe. But I think one way of that it could be you say fixing it, but it could be addressed is that just this admission. What I have a problem with is when museums just pretend colonialism doesn't exist or didn't exist. That's where I'm these excavations were made possible because of a power dynamic, right? That allowed European and American people to go to Nishapur and get these items, and then they split them with the museum in Tehran and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And there's other examples of this in Philadelphia, and a lot of it, this was common practice. I think interpreting that history is important, so we understand it today, because I think especially in America, which technically doesn't have colonies, but we do, and there's cultural relevance is that, I think that, I don't really want to get into it. I just think there's also a lack of education and understanding of the legacies of colonialism generally. Maybe less so here, I'll just speak from an American perspective, is that they do not understand how they've benefited, and I'll include myself, we do not understand how we've benefited from colonialism. And I think that it runs a huge risk. And, even people, when they talk about slavery in the United States, it's people are like, oh, well, yeah, it happened. That sucks. That there's no legacies of slavery. And of course there are, because the Jim Crow laws just ended 100 and something years ago. And, even less time from, we had a segregated society up until, the 1950s and 60s. And we still have segregation informally. So yeah, I don't disagree with you. Yeah. Okay, I think I'm gonna, so last one, and then I think we gotta go. My husband's gonna kick me out of here. Okay. Okay. Yeah.
This will cause a brainstorm. Could you describe for me, now we have a place called Pakistan.
Yeah, no, I can't just. Oh.
How you will call it?
I
think you will call it Indian. About America.
So they might call us South Asian.
Still, until now, the identity of the graphic is for the Red India. They took that up.
Yeah.
But it's their art, and still it's mentioned.
Yeah.
So I thought, that's...
So and even in the gallery title where it says later South Asia, that just means India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. And it means afterwards. So it means Islam came to this place afterwards, and it started influencing their art afterwards.
It's based on the civilization.
Yeah.
Chinese.
Yeah.
Yeah, Indian.
Yeah. And some museums group art from that region in Islamic, and some say it's Asian. And it depends on the history of the institution.
But it's separated.
Yeah.
It's not as I said, so called.
Yeah. Sometimes it is in the institutions. But I'm not an art historian, so I can't say what I think, But thank you. Okay. Thanks so much.